Welcome to the Geological Wayfaring the Future series. This is a special series of conversations that we are releasing in addition to our regular Tuesday podcasts. The reason being, the acupuncture and East Asian medical profession is facing a critical number of challenges as schools close. New federal guidelines on graduate education loans will dramatically change how much students can borrow. Beyond that is the issue of eroding insurance payments, and while acupuncture is increasingly integrating into the conventional system, acupuncturists are not. What are some ways we might move through the troubles of these times? That is what this series is for. We'll be listening to the perspectives and voices of practitioners who have been engaging the challenges. It's not always comfortable having conversations around difficult or contentious topics, but listening to understand, that's a good place to begin.
So if we're talking about entry level into the profession, just to be able to go and work, that doesn't have to be, not everyone wants to go teach, and not everyone wants to do research, and not everyone needs to have that doctoral degree, because some people literally just want to go clock in and out and do their acupuncture and go camping on the weekend. And we need those people to be in those jobs, because everyone needs more acupuncturists in the world.
This is the last of our wayfaring conversations for now. In this conversation, we're visiting with Bex Groebner. Bex is a founding member of the Acupuncture Workforce Alliance. She was called to that work because of a number of factors that include how many students don't have the financial literacy to understand how massive student debt will affect their lives and how that becomes a silent burden. There's the crisis we have with schools suddenly closing, and there is her concern that the structures that support the accreditation of schools and certification of new practitioners, it could disappear if the pipeline of new students falls below a level that allows these institutions to be financially viable. Bex is a numbers kind of person, and at the moment, the numbers for our profession don't look so good. She's been writing about this on her Substack and working with the Acupuncture Workforce Alliance to begin the process of creating alternative pathways to licensure in the state of Oregon. Not because she wants to get rid of the current system, but because if it fails, they will need a way to define what constitutes an acupuncture education, and that there's also a path to working legally. What Bex has to share might make you uncomfortable, maybe even angry. You could validly criticize her for not having a complete solution, but then I don't think anyone has a complete solution or understanding of the crisis that we are facing. Bex is taking a look at the current landscape, identifying problems we should be aware of, and proposing some solutions that could take us forward. She's beginning a conversation that's not easy to have, but one that we avoid at our peril. As with all the discussions in this Wayfinding series, it's an attempt to better understand the troubles we face and to consider ways through what is a new defining moment for our profession. Bex Groebner, welcome to Geological.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Happy to have you here. Our profession is having a rough go at the moment. And you are a person who has seen this. You've been working with it in some ways. And the future is uncertain. Well, the future is always uncertain, so there's that. But the future for our profession at the moment has some deep challenges. It's almost like we've had a fantastic summer of expansion over the past number of years, and now there might be a contraction or some kind of fall that's coming. And there are some things that you've been looking at and some things that you've been working on. You have a Substack where you discuss this. And I'm delighted to have you here on Geological to talk some about what you've been seeing, in many ways the path that you've walked, what we can do, what we might be able to do, some ideas for making sure that acupuncture is still ours to learn and ours to practice as we move into a very, very uncertain future. I've read your Substack. I've listened to some of the different podcasts you've been on. Something that really strikes me about you is you're very clear that you have a particular North Star. There's something that's important to you, that at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, it gives you guidance.
Yeah, I always come back to her. She's a 16-year-old girl who lives probably in rural Eastern Oregon, and she really wants to go to school for acupuncture. She's probably the first person in her family to go to college. She doesn't have any familial wealth. She doesn't really know much about the system, but she needs to come in and be able to go to school without going into massive debt. And she needs to be able to go back to the rural area where she lives and serve her community and have the salary that she earns there make sense for whatever that debt is.
So often I hear about acupuncture as the people's medicine, the medicine for the people. We both know this, and those that are listening know this. With a handful of needles, you could be in a big city, you could be in rural Nepal, you could be in rural Oregon, you could be anywhere. And you can do a lot of good for people. And it's not just the needles, but it's also the thinking and the knowledge and the tradition and everything that's come down to us through time in terms of how we think about medicine and health and connection. That guides what those needles do. That's a really important piece.
Yeah, for me, I think we sometimes have a bit of an identity crisis in acupuncture, and we identify a little bit too much with the needle, and it can create these problems where we have this scarcity mindset, like, oh, the dry needlers are stealing it, the 5NP techs are stealing it. But when I look at it, it's these rural communities that I've worked with in Nepal, and also where I grew up and came from and places I've lived and experienced, there's often a distrust of the modern medical paradigm. And we can think about the experimentation that's been done, the Tuskegee experiments, for example, or sterilization of Native communities. There's real reasons why there is a distrust for modern medicine, but we also know that modern medicine can be really, really important, especially from a public health standpoint. And, if you have a car accident, for example, right, we really need to be able to access some of that kind of care. And so there's this idea, I don't know if you've ever read the book Wind in the Blood, but it's great. It's about these modern medical providers that go down and they're trying to work with Mayan communities, but those Mayan communities are really distrustful and want nothing to do with them. They just want to use the curanderos. They're the healers that come from their own community. And so these doctors got really wise, and they realized that those healers from the community used a cosmology that was really similar to what we have in Chinese medicine. So they brought in a Spanish-speaking TCM physician, and he interfaced between the Mayan community and the modern medical doctors. And because the Mayan community was able to trust him, in fact, in the book, it's really interesting because they were not using moxibustion. These Mayan communities knew about acupuncture. They did acupuncture with pine needles and porcupine quills and things like that, but they didn't have moxa. And so instead of just coming and expecting people to come into the Western paradigm and, do everything that these doctors said, he came into their paradigm and he brought them moxibustion, and he showed the curanderos and the people how to use the moxa. And so there was some reciprocity there that isn't typical in these types of exchanges. And the people really trusted the acupuncturist. And so when they did need to go up the care ladder, there was a pregnant woman with preeclampsia, for example. She trusted him to walk her over to the other side to this modern medical care that she needed, and she was able to get that care. And I think that that's what we see in Nepal a lot as well. People trust us. They come often for their pain, and they see us 2 or 3 times a week versus going to the health post or seeing the Western provider that they rarely go to. And it doesn't feel great to go get a vaccination or to go get a medication, right? And they walk away and don't want to really go back there. But when they come get the acupuncture, it feels good, right? We might only spend 8 minutes or 10 minutes with that person too, because we're treating a lot of patients there, but they're spending an hour with us while they're sitting in the room, while those needles are doing their work, right? So we're just constantly building that relationship. And then when someone does need some amlodipine, I can walk them over to the health post and I can help them get it. And I can help them understand what the medication is for and what we're looking for and how we could continue trying to make some lifestyle and dietary changes, but that we really need to make sure they don't have a stroke. And that's just a very special place that I think that we work in the system. And one of the reasons that we're able to work in the system that way is because we learn much more than needling. We learn this paradigm that is, we talk about the Tao, we talk about yin yang, we talk about the 5 elements, we talk about the science and ecology of the body and how the body is related to the land. And especially for rural people, that is a language that can speak to them and can help us to cross those boundaries. And that is not something we find in just the use of point therapies across the board, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. In fact, I would go so far as to say, for those from the Western community who are adopting and using acupuncture, at least one aspect of acupuncture, they're using it in a very Western way. Why are they doing that? Well, it's effective. So there you go. And it can be useful in a certain way, but yes, they're missing that larger, broader context. I'm struck by your experience in Nepal where you're working with people with acupuncture. You also recognize very much where conventional medicine can be life-saving and very, very helpful. Those folks don't have an understanding of how to access that or how to think about it, or more importantly, who to trust. But they can trust you. You're kind of a bridge.
What's very different in Nepal is our acupuncturists are providing frontline care. And there's never been a time that I've been on the ground in Nepal that I didn't watch someone have a heart attack and that I didn't watch someone have a stroke. And so we're in a clinic where most people are coming in for pain, but because hypertension is such a huge issue and because we're looking at arrhythmias and we're looking at a lot of untreated underlying conditions, we do have to be on the lookout for some pretty major health conditions. And we do understand the importance of the type of preventative care that sometimes goes beyond just lifestyle and dietary recommendations, that we do need to consider medications for hypertension and medications for diabetes that really protect our patients and help improve their quality of life over time. And so we cannot be like just adopting one dogma. And to me, there's just medicine, and we just need to know how to practice medicine very well. And I don't want to get trapped into, I can only do this or I can only do that, but I do want to know my place in the system and where it's time for me to move a patient up on the care ladder in whatever way that looks like in order to make sure that they are not having an MI or not having a stroke too early.
I often think of my 8th grade shop teacher who would admonish us time and time again because we were knuckleheads and would use screwdrivers for chisels, which was not a great idea. He was constantly saying to us, right tool for the right job, boys. And I have to tell you, he's like in my pantheon of great teachers, because what you're just talking about here, what does any one person need at any given moment? And how can we bring the best of the care that we're capable of giving and our discernment to what they need? Sometimes what you need is acupuncture. Sometimes what you need is something to bring your dang blood pressure down now and in the next few months when they may not be able to get acupuncture.
Yeah. And it's really important. I think it has to do with setting aside some ego and also just there's some ethics to that. The patient trusts us so much. And Andrew Schlabach, who set up our program in Nepal, we're very focused on measuring our effectiveness. And, we run a free clinic there, so there's no insurance that we have to validate our treatments to do medical necessity reviews. We do this out of our own ethics that we need to look and make sure whether or not we're making change for that patient. And so we're constantly working as a team to figure out, with this unique individual, how can we measure whether or not our acupuncture is affecting change? And if it's not, we need to have referral parameters. We need to have safety conditions around this to make sure that if we're not making the kind of change as fast as we need to see that change happening, that we get them up the care level, because we are responsible in the situation and we need to ensure that that patient isn't just continuing to come for acupuncture when it's not the therapy that they need.
Right tool for the right job. Which in some ways brings us to another part of this conversation. Our profession needs a little tinkering and help right now as it is. There's a lot of challenges that we're facing. But I'd like to start with some of the challenges that you have faced. You went to acupuncture school. You came out with, like $169,000 in debt. That ballooned up big time very quickly. You came in looking to learn medicine to be able to help people. And there's a system in place with student loans that appears to be working against you in some ways, maybe against a lot of people. There's this, well, I'm going to let you talk about it. What happened and how that fits in with the other, I'm going to say, moving parts of the challenges that we face right now.
Yeah, so I wanted to go to school for Chinese medicine since I was 9. When I was 16, I met...
Wait a minute. Since you were 9?
Yes.
How does that happen?
I think my dad was in the military, and before having me, they lived in Taiwan, and so had all Taiwanese furniture and dishes and everything like that. The military paid for my Midwestern parents to come back home. And so when I was growing up, even though they were very Midwestern and they didn't know a ton about Chinese culture, but all the furniture in my house, all the dishes in my house were from Taiwan. We ate our Midwestern food off those dishes. There were Buddhas and big mahogany horses carved around my house. And so it was just very magical to me. And I had a couple of experiences with modern medicine that weren't my favorite. And my mom, I think, had a lot of them. So my mom was always trying to use herbs or use foods as much as she could to kind of bypass having to go to the doctor. I mean, there was all the normal stuff because it was a military family. We were vaccinated and did all that, but she definitely tried to use what she could with us. And so I liked natural medicine, and I really loved, there were stories, like all the furniture and the plates, there were stories on these. There were people doing things. I wanted to know more. And I just thought that was a beautiful kind of medicine to go into. My mom's family are Irish and Welsh, and when we say Western, I don't love the term Western medicine, because to me, Irish and Welsh people, they have their own versions or had a really deep traditional medical system. And my father is Czech, and on that side as well, there was a pretty deep medical system. But due to the effects of colonization coming in, a lot of those healers were displaced and even sometimes burned at the stake, right? And so we learned that we cannot use that kind of medicine. And so if I wanted to seek out how to become a healer within a tradition that was closest to what I might be able to find in my own ancestry, the Chinese and the Koreans and Japanese and Vietnamese and everyone who has preserved Eastern medicine, they preserved a tradition that had a cosmology that obviously is very different from what comes from my own ancestry, but that would be a way for me to get licensed and become a healthcare provider in a medicine that was more traditional. And so I feel so thankful to these cultures that have preserved this medicine every day, because it's really hard to access that from my own ancestry. And so, yeah, deep, deep gratitude for all the generations that preserve that. So when I was 16, I was working at the Capitol Theater in Olympia, and one of the folks that worked at the theater with me told me that they were going to ACAHM, which is the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine. So I did a little research. I thought that's a school that I'll go to. And there was a long path for me because I couldn't access financial aid at first and yada, yada. And so once I got there, I ended up changing to the National University of Natural Medicine. Once I was down here in Portland, I took 3 years of Mandarin while I was doing my undergraduate degree in physics, and I really wanted to be able to read the classical texts for myself. I love classical Greek everything, and so I wanted to kind of do a deep dive into the Chinese texts around the medicine. And I realized Heiner Fruhoff came to Portland State University where I was going, and he spoke, and so I changed to go to NUNM, and so that I could study classical Chinese text translation, which I did there for 3 years with him and some other doctors. And that was really good for me. I just really wanted to be able to read everything from the source and understand that. However, it was a much longer program than OCOM and cost a lot more money. So when I went in to talk to them about going there, this was in 2006, and they guaranteed me that no students had defaulted on the loan. I know you talked to Ryan about this a little bit. So it's really hard to default on a student loan when you have possibilities for income-based repayment. But at the time, I didn't understand how that all worked. And to be fair to the school, they were just in the point where they were switching into being able to use Graduate Plus loans when I started there. So they didn't really understand the compounding interest and the full breadth of what that was going to do. And so, but they said, oh, you have a son. So I had a 2-year-old, and they said, you can use these Graduate Plus loans to pay for him to be in daycare. Because I said, it's really hard with the way you've structured your classes. It's easier for me if we could do weekend courses and night courses. And they said, no, we don't do it like that. You just need to put your son into daycare, which you can use these loans to pay for so that you can go to the 9 to 5 class schedule that we have. Other students do it. It's going to be okay. And so I got into school in 2009. There was a little book that came out. Lisa Rolliter published a book called The Remedy. And in this book, it was getting passed around. It was like a pamphlet almost. It was a small book. It said that an acupuncturist, she'd done a study, and acupuncturists were making $35,000 a year, and also that 50% of acupuncturists were out of the profession 5 years after graduating. So I'd done half of my schooling at that point. I took the book to my dean and I said, this is not looking good. And she said, none of that is true. This person, just kind of has their own perspective and they're making these things up, and none of that is true. And our graduates are making a lot more money than that. And our graduates are staying in practice. And I never asked for any data. Why? I don't know.
That is a little surprising because you seem to be a pretty data-driven kind of person.
I am, and it is surprising. And it is, I think at a certain point, we just want to believe. And at that point, my loans were already getting so high. What would I have done?
In for a penny, in for a pound, yeah?
Yeah. Where would I have gone? What would I have done? So I just finished the program. I did, however, I had already taken a lot of my herbal classes, but I did at that point switch from, they offered the MSOM. They had just started offering an MAC. So I could save a few $1,000s. I think it was like, at that point, I saved $8,000 to switch down to that lower degree. And so I did that, trying to save some money. And graduated with $169,000 in debt, and I was pregnant when I graduated. And so I had already taken my boards. I was pretty much ready to go. And so had my son. Had two sons at that point and was trying to build a practice.
You had your hands full.
Yes. So I would go late at night to births and labors while my family were sleeping, do acupuncture for pain relief and to help when contractions had stalled. But it was really fatiguing because I had to come back, back home, and then my kids were up and then I was trying to do that. So I wasn't getting much sleep. I was making a little bit of money. I finally rented a space, but I was worried because 6 months after graduating, I was getting bills for these loans and they were huge and there was no way I could possibly pay that. So I called the loan servicer and explained the situation, and they said, yeah, just go into forbearance. And I was like, what is that? And they were like, you just won't have a payment. You can do it for a year and that's the best thing for you, which it wasn't. The best thing would have been for me to go into income-based repayment, but I was I was overwhelmed. And so I went into forbearance, and unfortunately in forbearance, you're not making any payment toward your income-based forgiveness later. And the interest is still compounding. And so I missed a year of that would have counted toward that time. And by the time I got out of that, about a year and a half out of school, my loans were almost $300,000.
Because the interest keeps accruing.
Yeah, because the interest keeps accruing. And I went into a bit of a spiral at that point. So yeah, I had, at that point I was renting a space and I was working a few days a week. It took me about 6 weeks to fill each day in my practice. And I was working with the bank, and the guy at the bank was like, Bex, for a small business, you're doing great. Like we wouldn't expect you to do this well. So I was getting a positive feedback from the small business counselor person at the bank, my credit union. But at the other side, I was really struggling and it was affecting my mental health. I was feeling like I had ruined my life. My dad, he grew up on a farm. He was in the military. He wasn't super keen on college in the first place. Honestly, he thinks it's kind of a waste of money. And because of the way that I went about it, borrowing these loans, like my dad's wife told me he used to stay up at night. He couldn't sleep because of my loans. And I guess that was the same for me too. I got a little bit suicidal. I was feeling like what was my family going to do? I didn't understand how the debt was going to affect my kids or my husband at the time. And I was really ashamed of what I had done because I was starting to see like I wasn't going to be able to pay that off. And I thought everybody else that I had gone to school with was probably working it out. And when I would talk to them, they would kind of say that it's fine. I'm an income-based repayment. And they would say, after this many years, it's going to get forgiven. And I think we were all just feeling really ashamed. And so we couldn't even have the conversation with each other. And I felt like it was personally my fault, and never considered that, this bigger system that was involved in everything that was going on. So around 2014, I signed up to go to Nepal with the Acupuncture Relief Project. I'd been in practice at that point for a little over 4 years. And I went to Nepal. I worked for 3 months. It was amazing. I worked 6 days a week and it was all clinic all the time. I learned so much from my teacher there about dosage and frequency. I had no idea that acupuncture could work in frontline healthcare in the way that it was working. And I learned so much more in that, brief clinical period of time, being there for 8 weeks and working with international medical standards from World Health Organization and understanding how infectious disease works in the world and understanding non-communicable diseases, and that we are so well positioned to be screening for those while we were doing acupuncture. And so I came back and it just really changed me. I had employees working for me at that time too. So I was trying to teach them what I was learning in Nepal, get better with our charting, get better with our ability to measure and frame treatment plans, to become a better diagnostician, which is really the hard part of doing medicine. And a school that I went to offered me a job teaching. And so I went there and I started teaching, and they were so proud of me. I was writing. I always have been a writer. I was writing about the experience. And so the dean at the program I went to said, well, also the CCAOM, which is now CCAHM, they want to feature you as a success story of acupuncture graduates. And so I had to give a picture to her. I had to write up the story of what I was doing. And so on the Council of Colleges, I had my little like write up as a success story. And even then I was like, but I didn't feel very successful.
No, you had a giant debt breathing down your neck, and oh my
Yeah.
God, what am I going to do with this? You're living a double life.
Yeah. And I was still like really struggling with this suicidality, and I was getting therapy around it because it just, I know intellectually that my sense of worth isn't attached to the amount of money that I make. I don't want to start crying, sorry. But emotionally, it does feel that way, especially the way that our culture is set up, that if I'm not able to make money, and even when you are making some money, but it's nowhere near enough to touch your debt burden, my own sense of worth just really wasn't there. And so it was there was some cognitive dissonance to being featured as a success story and being asked to come back and teach. And I actually, the first class that I taught and the longest class that I taught was ethics and jurisprudence. And so it was really interesting to just the struggle between what we're doing to ourselves, what we're doing to our graduates. It started to come through a little bit. Little pokes of light were coming through. And as I started working with the students, and then they offered me the biomedicine classes, because with my work in Nepal, which I kept going back and back to, understanding how to interface and work with this modern medicine, I've always had the philosophy that there's only one medicine. And so the dean liked that. And there's a way to teach this in an integrative way where we honor it. And it was great. The students would come into those biomedicine classes with an automatic hang up. They didn't want to learn it. And after a few weeks, they would be excited to be learning it. They would be seeing as an inherent part of the system. It was so fun to be in there with them. And I got to apply so much physics to the content that I was teaching, even the way that the toroid field that the heart makes is so similar to the solenoid that's going on in the middle of the planet. And so you can see the toroid field around the planet. You can see the toroid field around the body. There's ways of using science to show this microcosmic, macrocosmic relationship that we talk about in other language in Chinese medicine. I loved it. It was just so fun. I was so excited to be teaching. I love these students so much. I started reading Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks, and I got so invested in understanding pedagogy and understanding how to be a good teacher. And so I really did fall in love with the medicine in new ways and with my students. And they, even when they were older than me, it was kind of like they were part of my family, another kind of version of my kids in a way. It's like I always visualize like a dandelion, how the seeds go out, and think of the students in that way. It's like they're all going out from this flower, but they're all going out to do such different things and to land in such different areas. And they've all got sort of their own ways of learning. And it's really fun to navigate, like, how can I teach this one who's more, of a verbal learner, needs to learn by story and metaphor, versus how can I teach this one that's like the, typical sit in my chair, listen to the lecture and soak everything in person. They're just all so different. And you can see that they come from different communities, and that they're going to be able to go back to those different communities and bring the acupuncture in a language in a way that I would never be able to bring to that community. And it was just really inspiring to watch them growing. And then they would start telling me about their loans. And I started to realize that they were being harmed.
Harmed in a way that you were very familiar with.
Yeah. And I started to pull back a little from myself, because when I was really deep in my experiencing that for myself, and I had internalized it and I was blaming myself, and then I could see them internalizing it and blaming themselves, but it was happening to all of them, and it had happened to me. And so I started to go, there's something is wrong here, right? But I couldn't quite realize what was happening. And then in 2019, a faculty member that I worked with came to our faculty meeting, and he had spent months of work revising the curriculum at the school. He had taken Poca Tech was going by that time, and he had taken their like curriculum and pricing, and he had taken OCOM's curriculum and pricing, both of which were lower than ours. And he was like, we cannot be the most expensive program, because while I love everything that we do, we are harming our students, because he was listening to them too, right? And he presented this, and I thought it was so well done, and I was so moved by it. And this particular individual is just so humble and kind, and had also been my teacher for Shanghan Lun, and he always brought in a lot of this wisdom from those Han Dynasty texts. And anyway, I thought it was so great. And he was kind of brushed off. There's this way in these institutions where they do that very well to us. And then an extra class was added.
Let's see if we can pare down, condense, maybe make things more concise. We'll hear something extra now. That must have been frustrating.
Yeah, it was phenomenal. And they asked me to teach that class, and I said no. It's so hard to describe, because you're there, you love the students, you want the workforce to survive, you love teaching, and then there's this harm that's happening, and you're being paid to be there. And besides the pay, I'll say this too, there's this thing that started to happen as well, where going to teach at the school became a pathway for the potential for public service loan forgiveness, right? So you had these people graduating with massive debt who were then being hired back from the school. And even though the schools are now lowering the number of full-time faculty positions they have, so they're mostly hiring adjunct to save money, but these adjuncts all have this concept, if I can just get into one of these few remaining full-time faculty positions, this is a nonprofit, and so I can get this public service loan forgiveness, which takes my harm away while committing, like working in the institutions that are committing the same harm that I am trying to deal with. But, I don't know if that makes sense. It's a weird loop.
It's a situation where I can make my situation better, but I'm perhaps making it worse for other people.
Yeah. So there's some stuff there. So anyway, I ended up quitting teaching at that school, and I went to teach at OCOM, and that was a lovely program, lovely people, lovely students, and then woke up one morning to an email from the board and the president letting us know that the university the college, was closing. And there really was nothing that could be done, right? They'd known for years. I don't know exactly how many years, but they'd known for years that they were financially struggling, and they just kind of ran it into the wall. And so that taught me that this is what the institutions do. They run it into the wall, and we have to start looking at the data, and we have to start looking at the signs, because those guys up there in the wheelhouse, they see the rock we're about to hit, and we're all down here in the galley. We're like, doing all the little jobs down here underneath the deck, and we're not seeing it, and they're just going to run us into the rock. So we've got to get up, and we've got to take a peek ourselves at what's going on.
What's the data that would need to be looked at, and is that accessible? Can you even see that data?
Yeah, so after OCOM closed, I was go on the record for some articles that Tiffany Kamhe wrote with Oregon Public Broadcasting. And after I went on the record, I was contacted by a student who you recently interviewed, Ryan Hofer. And he has a master's degree in education and a master's in communication. And he was the student representative on the board of one of these acupuncture and naturopathic colleges. And so he was really back there seeing the inner workings of what was happening. And by that time, I knew that I could pull the IRS 990s on any of these schools, which gives you a lot of...
What's a 990?
It's a tax form that a nonprofit fills out. So any public nonprofit that we're going to for schools, students can pull those 990s and they can see the entire budget of the school. And I don't know exactly what the cutoff is because I've seen salaries as low as $90,000 recorded. I think it's actually if a staff member is making over $100,000 that their salary has to be recorded on the 990. And it kind of says where all the money is going. It tells you how many assets the school has, what they're using everything for. So if you go into those 990s, you can see some of the financial health that's going on with the school. And then you can also, what Ryan is really good at, this is not my strength. So this is why we have a team of people that work together. But he is really good at getting into the federal register and looking at whether or not schools are on cash monitoring. So schools go on what's called heightened cash monitoring if they're certain of their numbers are not looking good. So right now in the United States, we have 44 acupuncture schools. 2 of them don't accept federal financial aid, Title IV money, and some of them are private. So we cannot get the 990s on them, but 7 of them are on heightened cash monitoring. And then I know you spoke with Ryan last week. I haven't finished the whole podcast. I don't know if he talked about, he keeps a going spreadsheet for all of us that kind of clocks all of the various values of the schools so that we know which ones the federal government has directly explicitly said these guys are on heightened cash monitoring 1 or 2, which are different levels of financial precarity. And then there's a specific numbers that tell you if they're about to go on heightened cash monitoring or they should go soon because the federal government only looks periodically. So Ryan's kind of checking it all the time. So we can see which schools are in a precarious position. And it's quite a lot of them. You know, when we're looking at 30% or more of our schools before Rise and Ahead have even hit are in a precarious position, that's not a great look. So that's one of the numbers.
Okay. I want to dig into this just a little bit. So much of this is new information for me. I feel like I'm just becoming a student of what's going on right now. So the 990s, the 990 form, this is something that anybody can access. It's for schools that are nonprofits because they have to publicly state what their budgets are and basically their financial condition. That might behoove anyone who's thinking of going to a school. Maybe I should look and see how they're doing.
Any student should look at those.
Yeah.
And any faculty member or person that is considering going to work for a school should also look at those 990s.
So there's that. The Federal Register, where does that come into play?
The Federal Register is something we should just know about as citizens of a faux democracy. I know there's better terms for it, a republic, et cetera. But if you go on the Federal Register, you can sign up for alerts that are specific to education, and they will email you every single day about what is going on. So all of the stuff that we've been trying to teach people about the RISE rule and the AHEAD metrics, the review of the accreditor, ACAHM, by the NCBAHM, that all comes from the Federal Register. We just get emailed when these things come up, and then you'll have an email with a whole bunch of things that have to do with education, and you'll just go through and skim the titles of those and see if anything is related to what you're interested in, and then you can click on the gigantic PDF to read more if you want to do that. But this is where the federal government releases it's basically the bulletins that are coming out of our federal government. So when the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed and it had anything related to education, we got emails about that. So for people that are interested in understanding more, this is part of what we can receive as citizens of the United States is this information, and you can go and sign up. If you do the advanced search, you can sign up for whatever type of Federal Register information you want.
Now, and we're going to get it. I want to get into the accreditor. You said NCBAHM, which is something I don't know what that is yet. So I'm going to, we're going to get into that in a second. Where is the federal government getting this information that they're putting into the register that we might want to know about? Is that coming through some kind of regulatory agency?
Yeah, it comes through all of them. There's so many moving parts. It can be really hard for people to keep up. But for example, the RISE rule, which is what came out of the One Big Beautiful Bill that limited the graduate plus, not limited, but gets rid of the graduate plus loans, and we go back to direct loans only. And this is the one that acupuncturists hear about, the $20,500 cap each year with a $100,000 lifetime limit. So that came out of the One Big Beautiful Bill, and the Federal Register announced there's going to be an open comment period on this rule. And so you click on that and it says where you can go to comment. And it also tells you what your comment, this is very important if you are commenting on any of these rules. To the left, there's going to be a fact sheet that tells you what your comment needs to do to be a viable comment. Because I saw a lot of acupuncturists commenting on the RISE rule and they were like, I just don't think this is a good rule. And that is not the type of comment that is going to move the needle anywhere for you. They really want you to do specific things with your comment. They want data, if you have it, to back your comment up. They want it written in a certain way. So if you are commenting, it would behoove you. It's always the same recommendation on the comments usually. So it would behoove you to read that before wasting your time writing a comment, and make sure that you're doing it the way that they want it. And then you can upload it there. Once the comments are made, the Department of Education in this case will look at those comments and they'll decide if they're going to make any changes to the rule. And then they publish the rule. So that's the final rule, and that goes up, and then that's the one that's set. When it's published, then that's when it can be sued. Okay. I'm not a legislator or a lawyer or anything like that, but on the RISE rule, Merkley, one of our reps in Oregon, they did ask for the rule to be revoked. I think it's called a CAR. I can't remember what that stands for. And that is different than a lawsuit. That's just saying this rule, like Congress should get rid of this rule because it's not in line with the Constitution or other things like that. And when you have a Republican-led Congress, it's very unlikely that when they propose that forward that they would withdraw the rule that they had created. So it was more symbolic of anything, of these representatives saying, trying to just do whatever they could to show that they didn't support it. And now the lawsuits will ensue. So once the rule is finalized, you can sue it. So the AHEAD metric with the earnings premium rule, comments just closed on May 20th. And so the Federal Register will alert you of all of this. And then when that rule is published, that will go up on the Federal Register as the final rule for the AHEAD earnings premium. So if you sign up, and then you can watch for that and you can see when the rule is published. And then once it is, then that's when people can begin to sue.
It's a long process, isn't it?
It is a long process, but I think under this administration, because they've written, and like I said, Ryan is the best one to speak to about this, but because they have written dates into some of these things, it's moving very quickly. And I think that is part of the character of this administration in general, is the chaos and speed at which everything moves. And it's one of the reasons why people are getting so caught off guard. And I understand that. But when the administration is moving so chaotically and quickly, we do have to respond more quickly ourselves. And so that's why we came up with the proposal that we did and, all of that stuff. But and lots of acupuncturists are shouting that we're moving too fast, but it's not us that are moving too fast. It's the administration that we're trying to respond to.
Let's talk a bit about your proposal.
Okay.
It sounds like you've come to this, again, because we have a situation that's quite kinetic at the moment, big changes. And before we talk about the proposal, I'd like to hear what your concern is. Why do the proposal? What do you see coming with the changes? And and one more thing, how does your proposal help to mitigate that, the problems of that?
So I'll just say these metrics, as everyone has said again and again, they're unique to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, in that it's the earnings premium metric, and we're removing access to Graduate Plus loans. But these metrics have been coming down the pipeline for a really long time. It started under Obama, and our national organizations have known that these metrics were going to come down the pipeline. It's just that what we thought was going to happen was a debt to earning ratio metric that was going to lose Title IV money, the loan money, to acupuncture schools. There is Michael Itkovitz. He runs a group called the HEA group. So he ran that under Obama, the Higher Education Administration group. And then when the Obama administration stopped, he continued this on. I believe it's a 501c3 nonprofit, but don't quote me on that necessarily. So you can go to the HEA group. You can also sign up to receive their blog, which is their newsletter. And that will give you a lot of information. It's really good for prospective students, faculty, anyone that's interested in education should be there. And so they were looking, the numbers that they use are the numbers that go onto College Scorecard. And so they were looking at adjusted gross income on tax forms for graduates of schools. And in September of 2023, the HEA group released programmatic data for 6,300 graduate schools across the nation. So this is medical schools and music schools and all the schools. And we downloaded that data, and there are a number of acupuncture schools within that data. So ACAHM and UNM and Bastyr University and Austin, AOMA. There's a number of acupuncture schools in there. What's problematic is that when you sort that data by debt to income ratio, and in this data, they're giving it as a percentage. I know Ryan already spoke to this, but what we want is we don't really want to be going over 150%. So for example, I have a physics degree, bachelor's degree, and most people coming out of a bachelor's in physics at the time I graduated would be able to make $90,000 a year. So it would be appropriate for me to borrow, and this is tuition and cost of living. Mm-hmm. It would be appropriate for me to borrow up to $90,000 for that salary, and that would be 100%. I could even go over that a little bit because, like we're saying, 150% is still fairly reasonable. And I would be able to make a standard payment of 10% of my income over the next 10 years to pay that loan off. So that is considered reasonable. And if you look at the HEA data, for example, Oregon Health Sciences University that graduates medical doctors near my house in Oregon, their debt to income ratio is 120. So that's great. And Stanford Medical School, their debt to income ratio is 82. And the reason is not because Stanford is cheap, right? It's because there are so many alumni who are giving back to the school. They have enough money to give back for scholarships and to support students so that students are not having to borrow that much to go to school. So it really has nothing to do with the tuition necessarily having to be low. If the profession has enough money to pour back into the program to make the program affordable at those high rates, you can also do that. So I hope that makes sense.
Right. So in other words, the tuition could be high, but there's support through scholarships and grants and such that comes from donations. In this case, with Stanford, from people that have graduated, they're giving back, they're helping the next generation come along. The key thing here, if I'm understanding this correctly, Bex, is there is a measure where this loan is reasonable and paybackable. I don't know if that's a word, paybackable.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, it's totally a word. We're
Okay.
working with it.
And then there's a level where this loan just can't be serviced. It's not unlike if you want to buy a house and you go to a mortgage broker, they're going to look at your income and they're going to say, you can afford this much of a house. You can afford to spend, let's say, $300,000 given your income, but you can't afford to spend $500,000. And they'll give you a loan commensurate with what you can pay back, that you can service. But this isn't the case with education, although it sounds like now it will be.
Yeah, so there's accountability coming out, and it's really hard for me to hear all the cries to write letters against accountability for this, on these rules and stuff. But exactly what you're saying. So if you sort that data of the 6,300 graduate schools across the country, what you find is the top 10 worst performers, 6 of them are acupuncture schools. NUNM, the school that I went to, has a 750 debt to income ratio. ACAHM, the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine, is at 650%, and Bastyr is right around there too. And so what you can see is that we're winning at doing the most harm to our students. And
so these programs are basically underwater in terms of what your average graduate can expect to earn and how they're able or not able to service their loan.
Yeah. So when we look at alumni surveys, which those do exist, and we found a number of them, sometimes they can be hard to get. The schools won't give them to you. So you have to definitely be a student of that school to get them. But when we look at NUNM and ACAHM alumni surveys, they show the same thing. They show very low income, even some years as little as $25,000 for their graduates, and then going up to around the $48,000 mark. The schools will say, well, we shouldn't count that alumni data because that was only 8% response rate on it. And it's like, if I was running this school and I sent out an alumni survey and I got an 8% response rate telling me that my graduates were making $25,000, then I would be working my butt off to get a higher response rate on that, right? But instead what we do is we bury our head in the sand, which I admit I also did in 2009, right? I was like, I didn't ask for any data because it doesn't support my worldview right now.
And really, as human beings, we are all so susceptible to that.
And so what ended up happening, the government was saying for a while, these accountability metrics are going to come down the pipe. And so ACAHM, our accreditor in 2014, they wrote a letter saying, essentially we shouldn't be subject to these metrics because most of our graduates are self-employed. And so looking at the adjusted gross income on their tax form isn't a fair measure. There was also some blaming of student demographics. Graduates of acupuncture school go and do a bunch of volunteer work. Graduates of acupuncture schools have children and don't work right away, these types of things. And then in 2017, we also see the ASA and the ACAHM and the Council of Colleges. And Matt Bauer, who is the president of Acupuncture Now Foundation, he has talked about the problems with this too. So the Acupuncture Society, the Society of American Society of Acupuncturists, the ASA, that's the professional association. But they're not really a professional association in the way that other healthcare providers have a professional association. So typically, it's a 501c3 nonprofit that has a membership. So if you go to look at the APTA, the PT's big national association, I think they have 140,000 members of their national association. These are voting members. They get to vote on what their association does, right? And the same with medical and the same with nursing. But with ours, with the ASA, we are not members of the ASA. So we can be members of our state, and then our state pays money to the ASA. And then the ASA should then represent the states, but they're not representing us. They're not representing the individual practitioners, right? Regardless, their job is supposed to be to protect practitioners. But for all of these years, what they've done is worked with the accreditor and worked with the Council of Colleges to write letters against accountability metrics that would protect our students. So herein lies a problem for me, in which I don't really trust that organization to do the job that it should be doing, because it hasn't. And then in 2024, it decided to go into a real coalition with the accreditor, the Council of Schools, the examiner, right? The AHM, or Acupuncture and Herbal Medicine Coalition. It has 5 members because of the herbal suppliers that are in there. Each one of those member organizations gets 1 vote. Now, if the ASA were to say, we are going to start standing up for our students, we are going to start saying that we need these accountability metrics, let's all vote on it. Okay, they get 1 vote against these 4 other groups, and they'll never be able to stand up for providers now. There's such a conflict of interest happening in that coalition, and it's just very phenomenal to watch. So this is one of the problems that's been coming down the pipe long before this One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So I don't want to act as if this came out of nowhere. We've known that this was happening, and members of my team have been working on trying to figure out where we can pivot and move when this debt to earning metric was going to hit and we were going to lose our loans. The thing is, they decided to use a different metric. So they're using the AHEAD metric, which says you have to make more than someone with a bachelor's degree if you want to get money for your graduate degree. And here in Oregon, we're making between $38,000 and $48,000 at the 4th year out of school, and the bachelor's degree holder makes $58,000. So we don't pass that metric, and that's going to come a lot sooner than I think even my team thought that those debt to earning metrics were going to hit, because the first test of that is in 2027. I don't want to keep beating on this because we've talked about it so much, but 2027, and then the second test is 2028. And so the schools are looking at a loss of Title IV funding by 2028 at the earliest. So these are problems, but they're also not really problems, because this is the government saying, and regardless of the partisanship of the government is saying you can't continue to harm students in this way anymore. And so that is why we created this proposal.
Okay. I want to get into the proposal in just a second. There's so much to unpack here. I have just a few questions.
Okay.
So when you're talking about accountability, you're talking about these numbers of how much the education cost in relation to how much somebody can make in their first year of work. In other words, will your job pay you enough of a salary, or if you're self-employed, will your business create enough income that you'll be able to pay back a loan in a reasonable way? That's what we're talking about with accountability. I just want to make sure I have that right.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. And the federal government for a while now, since Obama, in fact, has been looking at this and going, things are a little bit askew, or maybe they're very askew. We're working on it. So since Obama, the government has been concerned about this issue of harm to students because they might acquire loans that they can't quite pay back. It's just that in the very most recent future, that has sped up dramatically, in part because of the Big Beautiful Bill, and in part because of the RISE rule, and then what you were just talking about, the AHEAD metric.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm following.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing to this, because I've seen some people pulling out the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. I think it's a $77,000 or around there salary for an acupuncturist. We didn't have a professional code under the Bureau of Labor and Statistics until I think it was 2016 or 2017. So they weren't measuring what an acupuncturist makes. But when we look at that, it's really important to understand that the BLS numbers are only for acupuncturists and W-2 employee. So if you're in a hospital or you're working in a larger clinic, so there's 140 acupuncturists in our country that work for the VA, and the VA requires you to have a doctoral degree to work there, right? They are W-2 employees. And there are some very lucky acupuncturists in our country that have salaried jobs where they're getting that W-2, and that those jobs are showing in somewhere around $77,000-$80,000 a year. I will say that is still not a fantastic salary in this day and age with the cost of eggs. However, it would beat the AHEAD metric, right? If that was our salary. But we have to realize is that is not the salary that the government is going to look at, because most acupuncturists are self-employed. They're doing a 1099, right? Or they're an LLC running their own business. And so we're looking at
Schedule C.
Yep. And so when people throw that back at us and say, your guys' numbers are wrong, the numbers we're using are the HEA group data and the college scorecard data and the alumni surveys that the schools themselves have done. And it looks at everyone, not just W-2 employees. And that's really important.
Yeah, I can see that. And look, people that are filing their Schedule C, there could be people that are filing and they're making $28,000 a year. There could be people that are filing, they're really, they're crushing it. They're netting over $100,000 a year. I mean, there can be a big spread that way. What is the college scorecard?
It's an online website where students can go and they can research the school that they want to go to. And it gives you information about the financial health of the school and tells you, the costs and everything associated with it. So it's made for students. It was created under the Obama administration in an attempt to protect students and give them more information.
Got it. So it's transparency. It's a attempt at transparency.
An attempt at transparency is a good way to say it.
Okay. So tell us about the proposal that you have, that you're working on in Oregon.
Yeah. So 28 states across the nation have defined standards for the education of an acupuncturist to get to licensure. Most of those states only define the hours that are required, and most of it's in what's called administrative rule, not in statute. There are some exceptions to that. So that's really important actually to understand. So the legislature in our state creates a statute, which is the law, right? And most of our scopes of practice are going to be defined in that law, which in Oregon, we have the right to be licensed independent providers of acupuncture, and we can prescribe herbs and we can do dietary guidance and tuina massage and that kind of thing, right? So every state has its own scope of practice and it's defined in the statute. But also in the statute, the legislature is like, we can't take care of like all the little details of everything that needs to govern the way that an acupuncturist arrives at licensure that makes them safe. And there's a lot of moving parts and things change all the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a licensing board. And in this particular case in Oregon, we're just going to put them under the medical board. Some states have their own acupuncture licensing boards, and some states were under different, right?
Here in Missouri, we're actually under the chiropractic board.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
So the legislature says who you're going to be under. And then what our legislature also said is we're not going to give acupuncturists a voting place on that board, which our medical board is podiatrists and osteopaths and medical doctors and acupuncturists, and now 5NP technicians. So instead of giving acupuncturists a voting place on that board, what we're going to do is we're going to create something called an acupuncture advisory committee. This is very similar to what happens in Washington State as well. So on the acupuncture advisory committee, there will be 3 MDs who practice acupuncture, and there will be 3 acupuncturists that are LACs. In Oregon State, an MD doesn't have to go to acupuncture school to practice acupuncture, right? So most of them are Helms graduates. So that board, the Acupuncture Advisory Committee, they're going to meet twice a year, and they're going to just make recommendations to the medical board about what it should do. And the legislature said the Acupuncture Advisory Committee has to define standards for the training of acupuncture in Oregon State. But the Acupuncture Advisory Committee never did it. And so we just have this floating duty that is sitting there in our statute that says our committee needs to make a rule. So a rule is something that your licensing board makes. It's called an administrative rule wherever you are. And the rule is much easier to change than the statute. Statute means you got to go down to your state capital. You have to lobby. It costs a lot of money, right? You have to lobby the legislature. It can be 2 years to find out if whatever change you tried to make went through, and then you may have to continue many years from that. To change an administrative rule, you just have to go talk to the licensing board, and they have to release public comment periods on that rule change, let everybody give them feedback, and depending on how big that rule changes, those public comment periods could go on for weeks or a year. And so we found that in Oregon, everything that we needed to be able to bypass some of this, the problem we talked about was in rule change. And by bypass, what I mean is that because of our acupuncture accreditor, we actually cannot train students in an economically feasible way. And that is because our acupuncture accreditor requires, first of all, 2 years of prerequisites in essentially anything you want. Those 2 years have nothing to do with acupuncture. And if you do take any of the biomedicine prerequisites, like biomedicine parts of the acupuncture program, they will not count if they are taken within that 2 years of time.
Let me make sure I got this then. If you wanted to do something like, let's call it pre-med, I'm going to do a little pre-med track and get pretty clear on the basics of conventional biomedicine. You can't bring that into your acupuncture program?
So the way you would bring it in is you would do 4 years. You would do a pre-med degree like as a bachelor's. The first two of those years cannot count. And then if you take anatomy and biology and all that stuff in the second 2 years, you can transfer that in.
Okay.
If the school lets you at that point.
All right. Good grief, this is complicated.
Yes. So the reason that the 2 years of anything you want are there is because our training to become an acupuncturist, the floor is 1,900 hours, and that is 4 years of training. And in this country, when you do 4 years of training, we call it a bachelor's degree. But we don't want a bachelor's degree because we want the other credential. So we had to stack these 2 years on. But I want you to understand, 2 years at a public university, when you're looking at somewhere around $18,000, $20,000 per tuition for each year, so you're coming out around $36,000, and then living expenses of $35,000 per year is what it's up to now. So that's 70 grand on top of that 36,000 to get those 2 years of general credits out of the way before you can even go into your acupuncture program. And those are invisible costs that are never counted into. The student feels it on the other side because the student has the loan for that on the other side. But the accreditor never counts that when they give you the tuition, and the school never counts that when they give you the tuition statements out, right? Like how much this is going to cost.
Boy.
Sorry.
So, Bex, I appreciate your physicsy mind and your mind that can do math. Mine doesn't quite work that way. Let me come at it from this angle and see if this makes sense. It sounds like our accreditor, they create an accreditation for a master's degree. They create accreditation for doctoral degrees too, I do believe. There's probably good reasons that they've done everything that they've done. My suspicion is that they're trying to advance the profession. And look, a master's degree sounds better than a bachelor's degree. So if I can come out with it and have a master's instead of a bachelor's, first, my family is going to be more proud of me. And secondly, patients might trust me more. And, there's all that stuff. How do I phrase this? Given that all professions need accreditation, and I think one of the things that our accreditor gives us, and the NCBAHM too, for that matter, is portability between states, that you can get educated somewhere. And look, I know there are some states like California, you need something different, or maybe you go to New Mexico, you need a different education. But by and large, if you are a diplomate of the NCBAHM, you can practice in pretty much any state. And it's wonderful to be able to have, I know that when I first went to school, first of all, I was delighted that there was schools that I could go to. And secondly, I could get some kind of licensure. I could take it all over the country. And so I think that kind of thing is important. I don't think we want to get rid of those structures. But as I understand it, or think I might understand it, those actual structures might actually be under threat themselves. They might disappear.
Yeah, so it is really good if we had a federal standard for acupuncture, and especially because whatever happens in Colorado with acupuncture and how that gets into the media, that affects the public's perception of acupuncture in Oregon as well, right?
What's happening in Oregon?
I mean, I'm just saying, like, if we have adverse events around acupuncture happening in a different state because the standards for training haven't been good enough, that adverse event that gets into the media is going to affect the public's perception, right? And in the same way, when we have positive events around acupuncture because acupuncturists are well trained and they're doing their job really well, that also affects the profession in good ways. So portability is important. And like you said, we can't just go from Oregon to Washington without taking a microbiology class. There's different little steps that have to be made between states anyway, but there is, I think, a need for us to recognize a national standard for acupuncture to keep the profession doing the best job that it can. And so that if a hospital wants to hire us, they know kind of what to expect, or if integrating us into the healthcare system.
But don't we already have that? Isn't that what ACAHM is for, is to set standards so that we do have that basic entry level that's trustworthy?
So NCBAHM definitely has the job of credentialing and setting standards. They run a safety database. Their exam is supposed to keep us all sort of on the same page. I do want to talk about the accreditor. I think most acupuncturists who take insurance might understand this a little bit more easily. If we talk about in another country, many other countries where there's single payer care, the taxpayer pays into the government, and the government gives the money to the doctor for providing the care, right? And so it just goes directly to the doctor for providing the care. But in the United States, I'm going to talk about Medicaid, which is in Oregon, because that is our payer system in Oregon that covers acupuncture. So taxpayers give the money to the government, and then the government gives the money to a third party coordinated care organization, many different ones, who decide whether or not the doctor gets to get the money, and the doctor has to perform certain things like pre-authorizations or creating medical necessity reviews or all of these other things, because that third party is taking some of that taxpayer money. They're skimming some of that taxpayer money off. So they can't just give it to the doctor, or they wouldn't make any money. You see what I'm saying? So when we look at education in other countries, money goes to the government and the government gives the money to the school. And why the government gives the money to the school is because there are shown to be jobs on the other side. The reason we go to school is to get a job. So they needs to be a job on the other side. So for acupuncture, if there's 30 jobs on the other side, the government approves the school to accept 30 students, not 45. And the employer on the other side reports back whether or not the graduate from that school is doing a good job. And if the graduate from the school is doing a good job, then the school can continue to get the money from the government. But in the United States, we've done this thing where the taxpayer gives the money to the government, and then we have a third party, the accreditor, sitting between the money and the school. And so that accreditor's job can be different. Some of them are Title IV gatekeepers, meaning they decide whether the school gets to have access to loans. And our accreditor, ACAHM, is a Title IV gatekeeper for freestanding institutions. So if an acupuncture school like the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine was a freestanding institution, then they will say whether or not that school gets loan money. But if the acupuncture school like NESA in New England is now underneath a large pharmaceutical university, right? And UNM's acupuncture program is underneath a bigger university, the institutional accreditor will decide to give the loan to that school. And so ACAHM in that place acts as what's called a programmatic accreditor. They just say will stamp that the program is okay. And that's where the standards come in, because they'll say we need the program to meet these certain standards that we've defined in order to have this credential on the other side of it. And we do need somebody to be doing that work. Where it gets problematic with the structure that we have right now, all other healthcare institutions, so the PT accreditor, the nursing accreditor, the occupational therapy accreditor, they all have employers sitting on their board and defining what the standards of training need to look like. Because like I said, you go to school to get a job. We've never had employers on the board of our accreditor. It's very confusing to me where their standards are coming from and how they are defining them. It looks like mostly educators and acupuncturists make up the commission of ACAHM, and some longtime administrative people and lawyers from schools. So we have had the lawyer from the University of Phoenix, Carl Gabi, working for the ACAHM since 2016. They just announced his retirement. So he worked for University of Phoenix and Brown Mackie, both schools that have had problematic outcomes in terms of taking advantage of students. So I'm happy to see his retirement announced, thinking maybe we can move forward and get some employers in there, giving some feedback to these standards. So like you said, it is really important that we have standards for the profession, but those standards need to be rooted in a few things. One, they need to be defined by employers, because we can't get jobs if we aren't doing the job or we aren't trained for the job. Two, they need to be built backward from scope of practice. And that means that ACAHM should be working with each state individually, because each state has a different scope of practice that it needs its graduates to be able to do. So while we do need portability, our graduates in Oregon need to be able to give evidence-based nutritional advice, and not all graduates across the country need to be able to do that, right? Graduates in California and Florida and New Mexico, they're primary care. So they have a different scope that they need to be taught to, right? So these are important factors of what goes into standards, and we need to do a better job with creating those.
A couple of points here, and this may be contentious. I get it that for PTs or nurses, many other professions, you want to hear from the employers. You want to know what the profession needs and how are we creating programs to teach to that profession. When I think of bringing employers in to talk about the acupuncture world, the acupuncture profession, look, most of us are self-employed. We don't have that many employers.
So we do have a number of small clinics in Oregon that employ 1 to 5 acupuncturists. So we're talking to a lot of them. We have a number of community acupuncture groups. Working class acupuncture employs 20 plus acupuncturists. With the Acupuncture Workforce Alliance, which is my team, we've been working to gather data, but it's only been for the last month and a half or so. So we have 26 employer responses back on surveys from people that are working with the tribes here in Oregon, providing care for them. One employer has 5 employees over there, from people working at the VA, from people working in university student health centers. And the feedback is really great and it's really telling. And I think one of the pieces there when we're talking about standards, if we look at ACAHM's new proposals, they're cutting 30 of the biomedicine hours out of the program. That's where they chose to cut. And employers are telling us we need more, not less of that content. And so it's clearly not been informed by the places that where we do actually have jobs. These cuts are not informed on that. And so that's a big problem because we're going to be looking at using one of these new proposed tracks through ACAHM that are going to be graduating students that not only can't necessarily perform to scope, which is a safety concern, but also can't necessarily perform what their bosses or future bosses would need them to be able to do. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, a couple of things. Look, there's the NCBAHM, and you were saying that that's to ensure that safety is being met to some degree. I guess there's a question of what are the standards for safety that we're looking for? And then there's this question that's in back of it, in my mind, which is, so what is an accreditor for? Maybe that's it. Like, what's an accreditor for? Are they doing their job? And what would happen if we lost them? What would happen to the profession if we didn't have them? Because look, I get it that, especially in government and especially dealing with any kind of large group, when you come together as a large group, there's often compromises. There's often, it's like making a law. Almost no one's happy with most laws, but laws get made because, it's a big process, lots of different input. Maybe people with power get what they want. Maybe things get watered down because of different kinds of comment. Most people are not happy with group decisions, I think is what I'm trying to say. At the same time, if we didn't have an accreditor, what happens to our profession? Again, I'm looking at portability. I'm looking at every profession needs to have some kind of set of standards that everybody has to meet. You understand this stuff a lot better than I do, but I thought an accreditor, in part, is the authority that helps to set what that is. What am I missing?
Yeah, so the accreditor should be setting, if the programmatic piece of the accreditation that's done, they should be setting the accreditation, like the standards for the program itself. If it's a master's degree, it needs to do this, this, and this. If it's a doctoral degree, it needs to do this, this, and this, right? That's the concept idea. And then if you do those things, you get the stamp and then you get to move through. So I don't think that's too hard to understand. It's also something we do in the United States because we don't necessarily track how many jobs are here and how are these students performing on the other end of those jobs. Like in China, if you wanted to go to school for acupuncture, right, there has to be a job on the other side of it.
Yes, because we have a free marketplace. You want to do
Yes.
something, you get to go do it. I would rather live under this system myself.
Yeah, so I think each one has benefits and drawbacks. The debt, the loan, the unlimited stuff that we're talking about here is one of the drawbacks of the system. Potentially spending all of that money and coming out into a place where there's no job is one of the drawbacks of the system. Being able to choose to go to school for whatever your dream is one of the benefits of the system, right? We have these different things. And so the accreditor is how we do it in this country. And so they're there. Is the accreditor doing its job? So we've skipped a lot of steps. We talked about the seasonal correlations of this, right? And we skipped a lot of steps here. So we're often throwing out like, oh, PTs have a doctoral degree or these people have an entry level doctoral. Well, PTs went into hospitals and they had jobs in the hospital. And then the hospital said, we want you to have an entry level doctoral degree, right? And there's going to be pay associated, a pay increase associated with that. And so they followed, that was a natural progression versus us who didn't have jobs. We were not being told that we were going to get paid more to have this degree, but we were kind of, instead of staying on our own yoga mat, looking at all the other people around us who had done their work and then said, we're just going to skip this step.
And what's the step that's being skipped?
So waiting until we had enough jobs and really had a tight grip on what our role is within the larger healthcare system, and then having that healthcare system, AKA the employer, tell us what they wanted for training and whether or not a doctoral or a master's degree was needed for that, right? Some people say, oh, the VA needs us to have a doctoral degree, and that is true. And we can still get a doctoral degree, right? We can do stackable credentials like many other professions do so that we can still get the doctoral degree. But when you're talking about 140 jobs in the entire country, that's not a reason to make everyone have a doctoral degree. So we need to go through the steps, really understand our identity, really understand what the employers want us to be doing, and then train to that. And if that ends up being a heightened credential, we would train to that. But we just sort of skip the step and we're like, let's do it. And so we built this big summer. We had this big summer of these degrees. And so in terms of, is the accreditor doing its job? You could say yes and no, but the accreditor, when you go, why are all the students being harmed? And then you start to look around and the students, they tell me the same thing. It's the school. The school is bad. The administration at the school did this to us. And you look into that and you're like, the school has to take some responsibility, right? Like a lot of these schools moved to big campuses and they bloated things out and they were making it much more expensive than it had to be. And they have such high overhead. That's why ACAHM moved from a very low, kind of humble campus where they could have supported themselves through this. They decided to go spend millions of dollars downtown building out this huge, 4 or 5 story campus that they had. And so when this financial problem started to hit, they just couldn't maintain that structure. They couldn't pay the bills, right? And again, there's some skipping of steps and so the school did have some responsibility, but that same gesture was happening on a national level.
I think that's such a good point that it's something happening on a national level. Look, the schools have their role that they play. I don't think they're the complete bad guy either, right? They were there to serve a purpose, and we want them because without schools, we don't have new people coming into the acupuncture trade. It seems to me that our world got awash with, I'm going to call it the GRAD Plus money back in 2005, and it ran through the entire educational system. Not just the acupuncture world. I mean, it ran through the acupuncture world, and we're seeing the results of that. But the whole educational system was awash in a lot more money coming in through student loans. And when you have access to resources, you try to maximize that. I think it's true at the level of individuals. It's true at the level of organizations, countries. It's just kind of the way economics works. No harm, no foul. It's almost like you're the physicist, but it's almost like a law of the universe. If there's money around, people are going to try to maximize that. So,
of course,
so fair
if I
enough.
have more money, I'm going to go get some fancy cheese. You know what I mean? I'm going to spend more money.
And again, I want to come back to this thing about employers, and I hear your point, and I'm not discounting it by any stretch of the imagination. But again, I keep thinking about the majority of people that do acupuncture are self-employed. There might be other reasons people would like to have a doctorate besides an employer tells them that they need it.
Of course, I got a doctorate because I thought it was going to make me a better educator. And I know people that got a doctorate because they wanted to go into research and they wanted to get better with their science writing to bring acupuncture into that research field and to make it more recognizable. And I love school. I love going to school. I love getting degrees. So of course, totally a big fan of this. And this is not an either or situation. We don't have to do this or this. We can have all of these things. And I think about what Ryan was learning in the AIM committee. I think it's the Accreditation, Innovation, Modernization that he is part of, that developing that. And in the ethical guidelines for accreditor behavior that are going to come, they're going to be finalized in 2027. It says that an accreditor cannot require standards to be taught under a higher credential than necessary. So if we're talking about entry level into the profession, just to be able to go and work, that doesn't have to be, not everyone wants to go teach and not everyone wants to do research and not everyone needs to have that doctoral degree, because some people literally just want to go clock in and out and do their acupuncture and go camping on the weekend. And we need those people to be in those jobs because everyone needs more acupuncturists in the world.
For sure. Or you might have someone who is self-employed. They don't want to clock in and out. In fact, they don't want a job. They want to practice.
That's actually really important, that we have people that are successful at being self-employed, however we want to define that, who are then giving feedback to the accreditor about what standards need to be. And when you are self-employed, if you are successfully self-employed, what you're going to report, and we have collected some data from a few self-employed people, and of course what they say is more information around business and how to run a business, more information around insurance billing, more information for me and understanding of dosage and frequency of acupuncture, because I didn't know how to frame treatment plans and was out there by myself trying to figure this out on my own. So we don't have very many of those yet, but that tends to be the sort of gesture in the reporting. And that's also really important to have the feedback from those folks coming in, right? If you just have a bunch of educators sitting around deciding what standards for training should be, you're going to have a very skewed perspective. And I'm sorry to say, as an educator myself, we always think more hours are better. And that's not necessarily what we need to have. But I do want to come back to a second, because you said with the schools, like, they're not necessarily the bad guy. And something I want to be really careful about here. No one here is a bad guy. And when I point up and I say this problem has been caused by the accreditor, Ryan taught our team this question, right? Is it incompetence or by design? And we often struggle with that question, like, oh my God, look at what's happening here. Is this incompetence or something my husband often calls just mediocrity? Or has this been designed to hurt us? And there's almost no case where we come to the conclusion, almost no case, that this has been designed to hurt us. Everyone's kind of just been doing the best job that they can, right? Myself, participated in harming students because I worked for these institutions. The students trusted me. They followed through often with the education. I've had patients go to school to become acupuncturists because they loved getting acupuncture from me. And I can think about that, right? I participated in doing this. And we have to recognize that there does have to be accountability when we have participated in harming. We're harming each other all day, all the time. I harm my kids by accident all the time, right? Because I'm not some expert parent. I'm learning as I go. We all, the people at the accreditor, the people at the schools, the faculty, the students, we're all learning. There was this big Graduate Plus experiment. It didn't go well. No one's a bad guy. But what we have to do now is we have to repair it, right? And we have to figure out how to be accountable for each of our participation in it. We have to forgive each other. We have to make it right. And so if we're pointing and saying, it's your fault, that really doesn't matter. But we do have some institutions and individuals who have more power right now to correct the problem and make it right. And I really believe that they can. But if we call them bad guys, they're going to be less likely to try to repair. So that's my only thing there.
God, this is just like part of the enterprise of living, right? We have a good idea. Something seems like a great idea. Hey, here, I'm going to do this. And then you find out, oh, it didn't go the way that I thought it would. I had a great idea. I learned a lot. And a lot of what I learned was it didn't work out nearly the way that I thought it would. We all have this. It's impossible, I think, to live a life and not run into that kind of problem. I'm really struck, Bex. On one hand, you're in the school, you're in the institution. There's things you're doing that are because you're part of something that's causing harm. There's that. There's also a piece, and I think it's worth saying, brought a lot of good, brought a lot of help. You help people learn things. You help people to acquire skill. You help people to soldier forward in difficult times and build themselves toward being able to practice acupuncture. There's that too. One of the things that I think we all get to explore throughout our lives as an acupuncturist is, how does this yin-yang thing work? It's because these complementary, seemingly opposites are inseparable. How can we learn to sit or stand or maybe even work from a place where we not just embrace it, but allow ourselves to actually live into the contradiction that it asks us to live into?
I mean, that's the beautiful part of being human, and everything we're doing here. Like, I talk to my team all the time. Someone asked us, what are you guys going to do if you fail? And I was like, at this proposal where we're trying to define state standards in Oregon, and every state needs to define their standards in case the accreditor does fail. We need to have standards in our state so that other folks don't come and just take over what we're trying to do or undertrain, or, you know what I mean? This is an important thing. But it's also just working together with this team. There is a lot of mediocrity in the world. And
I've noticed.
The team,
I participated in it at times.
The team that we have at the Acupuncture Workforce Alliance and the Oregon Association of Acupuncturists, our education task force, it's like everyone is working so hard and so well and putting so much time into it. We all will end up burning out if we continue going at this rate, but it is phenomenal to be able to work with a team like this where everybody's strength is really coming up and we're figuring out how each person can be best positioned to do the role that they need to do to get this job done. We all have our North Star. You heard about mine, but Ryan has his own, and Danielle has her own, and Debbie and Kelly, everyone has their own. And so I feel like there really is no way to fail here. It doesn't matter if the whole acupuncture profession falls apart, because the things that we have done together, we have always kept it about kindness and love. We are always staying focused, because it's actually really hard to do that, especially when we receive texts and emails that from people that are very emotional, going through a lot and taking it out on us. I think Danielle says, you don't have to kill the messenger, but it certainly feels that way sometimes. And it's emotionally trying, some of the stuff that goes on. And the I Ching talks about the difference between reacting and responding. And so our team are constantly, there's a initial thing where you just want to react when the stuff is coming at you, and you think about doing push hands. If you react, it just doesn't work. And so we really have to learn how to respond. And often that means sitting with it, helping each other stop reacting when we are, bringing it back to kindness, love, compassion, bringing it back to our North Star. There's so much fear here that it would be really easy for us to get swept up into that and to get lost. And so that's, I guess, the thing that I keep coming back to is that we have done so much high quality work together. We've poured our heart and soul into it. There's no mediocrity happening with this team. And it is really rare to find yourself in a position with a group of other human beings who are all striving and working so hard in this way. And so I don't know if I'll ever find myself in a team of people again that has been so rewarding to work with. So, and the goal that we have to save high quality acupuncture education, make sure that we can preserve that through this crisis that we're seeing, that's all worth it. And even though my husband hopes he'll get me back someday, and Danielle's husband hopes he'll get her back someday, and they, I see none of my friends right now. We don't have time as full-time clinicians doing this other work. So it's been really inspiring. And you asked what happens if we lose the accreditor. I think some people might think that I want the accreditor to burn down. And so I want to be really clear. I don't want the accreditor to burn down. I want the accreditor to change their behavior. But you saw that they already are. You got the straw poll. Everyone got the straw poll. They are trying to find a different. I don't love it. I don't love the proposals, and I'm writing a whole bunch of stuff back to them about what I think would be better. But they're trying some different things. And as we're in this big experiment together, that's the only way we're going to survive. We can't keep doing the status quo. And so as I see these national organizations now start to pivot a little bit out and away from the status quo, which I granted is very, very scary, that feels like a win. That feels like maybe the boat can be turned a little bit, right? And we also have to recognize that the federal environment is failing on multiple levels, and states are coming back down. So it really is about working with our communities that are closer to home. When you have to preserve that coal to get through to the next time that you need to cook with that fire, you bring it closer to home, right? We can't be out at this federal level and just counting on that to stay good for this. But it's not forever. We just got to get there. This one administration, there's going to be a massive fallout from this administration. How long it's going to take to recover from, I have no idea, but we will recover. Sometimes I feel like it's the patient with adhesive capsulitis in my office that's crying because their life is ruined. They're never going to be able to ride their motorcycle again. They're never going to be able to take a glass out of their cupboard. And even if they get no surgery, even if they get no care, that's not going to last forever, right? But in the moment, they're catastrophizing. They can't see past it. And there's a lot of catastrophizing in this moment too. And this moment is not going to last forever, but we can recognize it. We can preserve what we need and get to the other side. And hopefully the accreditor does make it over there. It looks precarious right now, but one nice thing about this administration, they made it a lot easier to make accreditors. We're going to see some really corrupt accreditors pop up, but we'll be able to make a new one if we have to. Let's just hope we don't.
So it sounds to me that because of the way the government has changed how the money flows, they basically turned off the tap. And now that the tap is off, we have to work within a new set of constraints.
Yeah. We need a different watering hole.
We need a different watering hole. Look, I've read your proposal for the acupuncture workforce in Oregon. It sounds to me like there's nothing in it that says you guys shouldn't use ACAHM.
No. ACAHM stays. Yeah.
Yeah. ACAHM stays. The accreditor stays. You're not saying get rid of it. You're saying we need another pathway given the constraints that we now have on how much people can get in their student loans and what kind of degree that might finance.
Yeah, I mean, we practice preventative medicine, or even if you're playing chess or Wei Chi, you're, I hope, thinking a few moves ahead and not just thinking about what you're going to do right now, right? We need to think about if we get stuck or trapped in this area, how can we move out? And in Oregon, we have something called the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, or HEC, and they actually work under our Oregon Degree Authorization Department. And so they can not accredit, but they can approve degrees as long as if our licensing board gave them permission. Right now, they don't have permission to approve an acupuncture degree for us because in Oregon, unlike 22 other states, we are only allowed to go to an ACAHM accredited school. And so if ACAHM fails, or if we lose access to graduate loans, either one of those things really prevents programs from running in Oregon, especially for students like my 16-year-old rural gal in a rural area of Oregon, because she's not going to be able to pay out of pocket, the $169,000 that I paid to go to NUNM. And so in that situation, we want to have that backup of that HEC approval be a viable option for our schools. And I don't know what, nowhere in our proposal are we calling for a bachelor's degree. And in fact, years ago, I had mapped out how we could run a TCM bachelor's with a 2-year master's. I was like, this is great, right? Why is our master's degree 4 years long? No other profession has that. Let's cut the cost down with a 2-year master's. But that ship has sailed. That is not a viable option anymore. And so unless it's taught in a modular way, the modular programs we have right now, they cannot take that many students. They're really limited to like 15 students a year. And when we're looking in Oregon, the last year OCOM operated, it graduated about 50 students. And that's about what NUNM was doing too. And then we have the community acupuncture program here graduating 15 to 20. With these two big schools, one closed, if the other one closes, we're losing 100 grads a year.
And your workforce is shrinking.
And our workforce is already shrinking by 2% every year. And we're looking at, people aging out of the profession and then no one coming in to replace them, while dry needling has become legal in Oregon and 5MP techs. So we definitely do have people to go in and stick filiform needles into people, but we don't have the provider type learning that ecological medicine that can interface and act as a bridge. And so, yeah, everyone says acupuncture will survive. Well, when they're saying that, they're talking about using the needle will survive. But what I'm saying is that's not who we are. We are a bridge. And I don't know any other healthcare profession that speaks this medicine, that talks about the traditional healing techniques and the way that the body and the earth interact together, that can speak to rural people, that can speak to people that have been suffered abuses from modern medicine. You know what I mean? We are a bridge. And what happens if we lose that? What other provider type would do that?
You've taken on a big mission. And I think we all are quite cognizant of the transition that we're in right now, whether we like it or not. It's almost as if we had a glorious summer and now the tap is turned off. It feels a lot like fall.
Yeah, so we're running into that with people. There's a lot of grief and also a lot of anger. And anger is, to me, how I understand it, when everything is pared away, so that plant cuts out every possible thing it doesn't need, and it takes the essence of itself and it puts it into a seed, and then that seed falls on the ground. In order to make it through the winter, it's protected with that hard coating. And then the spring comes and the sun shines down, and then inside that seed, it feels the warmth, and it has to generate some heat in there to break open from that seed casing and grow toward the sun, that quality of zheng in Chinese medicine, and to be upright and to do its best job. And the anger makes sense when we have this blockage in our way and we need to move through a blockage. But the grief is a little bit harder, the grief is the part where we are cutting back, where we are paring down, where we do have to decide what defines me, what is my DNA that I need to put inside of this seed to make it through this winter that is coming from this administration, right? And if we spend all of our time arguing and fighting each other, we will exhaust the energy that we need to identify the most important piece of ourselves, and we're not going to make it through. So we have to come together somehow. I couldn't be in a relationship with my husband or my kids if I wasn't willing and really good at compromising. And the ability to compromise is important for all of us right now. None of us are going to be able to take every single part of acupuncture medicine with us through the winter. So we have got to think about, like, what can I really let go of, pare this down, get it in the seed, and then get through that winter so that on the other side, when the sun comes back for us, right, and we feel that little bit of warmth and we can start to grow together. And we really have to keep our eye on the North Star. Every one of us should have a North Star for this medicine, because that is how we use that quality of Jung. That's how we know where to go when we come out of that seed on the other side. And I have no idea what that's going to look like. Grieving people in the profession keep telling me keep asking me, like, what does the program look like? What are you going to design? How much is it going to cost? And of course, I've got some spreadsheets and some little data stuff going, but I'm just one human being. And what we decide on the other side, I'm not in charge of that. And I don't know what the resources are going to be left on the other side. And we are going to have to come together, and we're going to have to do this as a team, and we're going to have to make some compromises. So I don't have a design on the other side. And so maybe that feels scary. We're going into the unknown, but that is that quality of the kidney. That is the quality of the water. That is why we have to say, I feel afraid, but I'm going to use the wisdom that I have brought up in the rest of my life and know that I have to have some trust that in the unknown, if this medicine is meant to exist, and by medicine, I don't mean just the use of the filiform needle. I mean the coherent paradigm of Eastern medicine with all the beautiful things that it brings. This is the one form of traditional medicine that we can get licensed to practice in this country, right? I don't know how we're going to manifest that on the other side, but if we can stick together and go through this grieving process and use our wisdom and figure out how to pare this down to the most essential parts, get through to the other side, we can have all the things if we do it together.
That is often the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
How we figure out how to do it together. Well, Bex, thank you. I only wanted an hour of your time. I'm sorry I've kept you so long.
I really appreciate you. It's a joy to talk with you.
We're on quite a bit of a journey at the moment, and I appreciate that you're looking at options. You're tremendously data-driven, so if people want to see what you've been thinking about, where you're getting your resources, how you've come to thinking what you think, we'll have a link to the workforce document that you've been working on.
Yeah, and I'll just say that Danielle Rigi and Ryan Hofer and myself are more than happy to jump on phone calls or Zoom calls with people, emails sometimes, but it often works better to just talk through this stuff. And so we try to make ourselves as available as we can until we're completely burned out and then we can't do it anymore. But still, we're doing that.
Don't burn out. We need voices, and I agree. Often with email, especially with social media, a lot gets lost in translation, so to speak. And so to be able to talk, to be able to have conversations, again, thank you for your time today. I think long-form conversations are useful because it's a chance to meander a bit and wander through what can be at times a confusing and frightening landscape. And being able to talk to each other, I think, does help tremendously.
Yeah.
So we'll keep at that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Bex.
Bye.
I think it takes courage to face a big problem and get started working on it when you don't have all the information, but are willing to dig into what you have, willing to get started, work with some other people to help you along the way, and see what kind of progress you can make. The Grad Plus loans have changed the educational landscape of the past 20 years, but that financial faucet is being turned off, not just for the acupuncture profession, but for many others as well. Maybe it's not a bad thing, as it will force us to reconsider what is essential to an acupuncture education and perhaps prevent students from being saddled with massive debt. If Bex's numbers hold true, then the schools that were awash with Grad Plus loan money are in a precarious position, and that would appear to be most of the schools. And again, this isn't just the acupuncture trade. This is a trend that is happening throughout higher education. This has tremendous downstream implications. I don't think these are issues that we can look away from. At the same time, it is also an opportunity to reconsider how we might be able to restructure an acupuncture education to be more affordable, more accessible, and maybe even more relevant in the world in which we're living into. It will not be easy, but anything worthwhile rarely is. I hope you found our little series here on wayfinding our future to be helpful in getting a glimpse and a grasp of the challenges that we have ahead. If you found it to be helpful, please do share it with a friend. I'm curious to know what you have thought about our wayfinding series. Feel free to drop me an email with your thoughts and comments. I'd love to hear from you.